Before we start, let me also mention a few other upcoming webinars. First of all, tomorrow we have one coming up, Best of Breed, Future-Proof Your Business with IDM 2.0. This is a joint webinar with some of our partners, such as Layer 7, Radiant Logic, SailPoint, and the Silo Solutions Group. Jerry Gable represents Axiomatics in tomorrow's session, which I expect will provide valuable insights on identity governance, federation, and how this is combined with an optimal user experience. An interesting webinar coming up there, I think. The next one, at the end of this month, our colleagues will be presenting a very hands-on session on applying fine-grained authorization to Java model view controller frameworks. So that one will be interesting as well. So sorry for this little stealing your time with these pre-announcements, but I think those webinars may be of interest to those who are here today. Now, let me present today's presenter, Sridhar Nair, who's the Director of Developer Relations in Axiomatics. And this program, the Developer Relations program, is very important to us at Axiomatics. As it happens, most of our end users actually are developers or architects. So the program aims to make it easier for developers to implement externalized authorization solutions. It's aimed to support developers, programmers, security architects, and system architects. So with these overall objectives, we intend within this program to provide products optimized for developers and tools, toolboxes to make life easier when you implement solutions like this, training and education, and community support. With this, I will hand over to Sridhar in just a second. You can tweet during the session at Axiomatics, hashtag #Exacmal is available, and we will of course also consider those tweets during the presentation. Now, Sridhar, are you with me?
Hi, Fun. Yes, I am.
Great.
Thank you, Fun.
You will take us through today's session, right?
Yes, I will. Thank you, Finn, and thanks for joining us in this section where we talk about externalized authorization, why you would want to use that concept, how you would decide what kind of applications and services you would like to externalize the authorization from, and also once you've decided what to externalize in terms of applications, how do you decide which is the best approach to take once you have decided on that path. But before I do go into the details, let's just give you a quick kind of a recap of the concept for people who have joined this concept recently. The idea behind externalizing authorization, it's not new per se, but it is changing the way we do certain aspects of security. So it's good to have a recap. As you would know, access control within an application or a service consists of two main things: authentication and authorization. Authentication basically lets you tell the system who you are, while authorization then has rules at the back end which lets the system decide what kind of access, what kind of actions can be performed by that user. When authorization isn't done right, you can expect a lot of catastrophic events, be it disruption of services, be it exposure of personal information, and be it the fines that comes along with it. For example, you will see, and these are just examples picked out of the news. It's not specific to any customer per se or any institution per se. You could see Citibank had exposed details of 150,000 individuals who had gone bankrupt. Or you can see news along the lines of electronic health records being widely publicly available because of the authorization systems not kicking in place and disabling that kind of access. Or you can see more Web 2.0 kind of services like the Facebook's download your information, releasing too much information about your contacts and so on. So you can see that authorization when done wrong or not right can lead to exposure of private information, leading to both inconveniences as well as big fines that comes along when you're looking at regulated and private industries. But even though authorization plays a key role, we don't spend too much time on security and authorization specifically. If you just look at a typical project, about 80% of the time is spent on business logic, while about 20% of time is really spent on security. I'm not saying that that is the wrong mix of times, but we might actually be able to do a lot with the 20%, but we need to optimize it to the point where it takes care of all the security aspects. And that's where we hope externalizing authorization makes the difference by still being able to use 20% and still clamping down on the problems associated with not doing it properly. So if you look at the situation right now, how do developers or application developers, not to pick on the creed as such, do it? A lot of times, the logic of authorization is inside the application within the if, then, else loops, or logics related to SQL statements or whatever it is. They are mixed along with the business logic of the application, making it harder to maintain. And when complicated policies come into existence, it becomes harder to also implement. And then, of course, once you kind of outgrow the in-app kind of solutions, you go to homegrown authorization services where you decide, okay, I have too many applications which are doing in-app. Let's just externalize it to a point where you write your own homegrown authorization service. But you'll end up having to scale beyond what you thought your authorization homegrown service would have had to handle. And then you start looking for a proper externalized authorization service. And you could then also, of course, rely on application frameworks which provide some form of authorization. The problem with authorization application frameworks and authorization within them, of course, is that you have to rely on, if you have to rely on multiple containers or languages, you have to implement authorization frameworks within each of these application frameworks as well as within the language that they support. So it becomes tedious and hard to maintain. So what used to happen in the olden days where authorization used to be about who, so not really on our role-based access control, but related to the role-based access control. Now you see that when the systems have grown bigger and the policies associated with them have grown more complex, it's a lot more. It's to do with the context between the objects that exist in the system, the relationship between them, the devices that you're trying to use to access, the delegation aspects, and a lot of other properties of the user, the object, the system per se, and so on. So it becomes hard to handle these additional information within a pure role-based or pure in-app kind of applications that provide authorization. So authorization has moved on from just about who to what, when, where, why, and how, and we need systems which can capture all these aspects about authorization. So earlier on, when it used to be about the user trying to access an asset, an information asset, he could just query the application and say, I want to access the records in a database table. And the application will have internal logic if you have an in-app application authorization system, which says if the user is Bob, then allow access. Okay, here you go. Information asset is sent to the user. What we're saying when it comes to externalizing authorization is that you move away from this in-app way of doing things. And when the user asks the application want to do access certain aspects of the data, the application then hooks on to an external policy decision point, PDP we call in the lingo, but you could consider it as a generic decision engine, a rules decision engine, which says, given these rules, I can allow access or I cannot allow access. And then the application uses what is called the policy enforcement point, which is the hooks in the application, which is used to call to the PDP and say, can I give an access to these people or this user? And you get back a permitted or deny based on policies which can be complicated or as simple as you wanted. But the key point, of course, is that it's away from the application and it's become centrally managed. So when you have given this kind of policies and access, then the application can go ahead and give access to that information asset that the user was asking for. So that is the core concept of externalizing authorization for those who weren't clear about it. Now that we have established that, let's go to the more deeper end of the presentation and look at why you would want to externalize your authorization above and beyond what we have talked about so far. So there are different aspects that you would want to consider in your authorization systems. And if any of this applies to you, or all, or a mix of these points applies to you, you would be an ideal candidate in terms of externalizing authorization. So if you are interested in the security of the systems and you want to make sure that you do not give access to people who are not authorized to that system or that resource, you would be looking at externalizing authorization. The same with compliance. If we are in an industry which is heavily regulated and you have compliance that needs to be met, and you need to prove that you are compliant to certain regulations and rules and so on, externalizing authorization is a way to go. You have a lot of information that you really want to share, but you don't have the infrastructure behind to support that sharing. So you are kind of forced to silo off all this information, which you rather share. Then you are another candidate who would like to look at externalizing authorization. You, at the same time, also want simplified infrastructure administration. You do not want to have applications which needs to be maintained every time the logic of authorization changes. You do want to have a centralized place where policies can be managed, deployed, and changed. That would be another reason why you would externalize authorization. And of course, you have complex authorization policies. Of course, it doesn't mean that you cannot do simple policies with externalizing authorization, but there is a kind of a cutoff point where you say the cost of externalizing is worth the amount of work you would have done otherwise because of the complex nature of your policies. The more complex your policies become, it becomes easier if you externalize them and manage it centrally. And of course, last but not the least, you want to make sure that the people who are writing the application and people who are writing and deploying the policies are not the same. You want to have separation of concerns and separation of duty. If any of this ring a bell in terms of what you're doing, you would be an ideal candidate in terms of looking at to see whether it would help you to externalize the authorization. So, but all in all, what we are saying is that if you are in need for solving complex authorization issues, externalizing authorization would be one of the best things for you to do. While talking to customers and people in the area of in the business that we are in, we hear a lot of common questions. Some of them are listed here. Foremost among them is, can all commercial off-the-shelf software be enabled for use within policy-driven externalizing authorization? That's a pretty good question, because a lot of customers buy off-the-shelf software which to them is a black box, and then they have the daunting task of trying to see whether they can fit in retrofit externalized authorization within that software. And a lot of times it is not even advisable to mess around with the internals of this commercial off-the-shelf software. And the question becomes, where do you do it and how do you proceed with it? So that in the rest of the webinar, I will talk a bit about it. But going into the next questions, of course, we have questions about legacy systems, which is the other end of the spectrum, where you say, I have mainframe applications that if I need to externalize, how would I do it? And the question, of course, also becomes, is it only about security and compliance that you are pushing for externalizing authorization? And hopefully the slide before would have given you an idea of it's not just about security and compliance. Of course, they are the key features which push for externalizing authorization, but it's also about maintenance of infrastructure. It's also about separation of app logic and business logic, and so on and so forth. And question, of course, becomes, what are the preparation that must be done before you shift, which hopefully the rest of the slides content will help you figure it out. And where and when can software components for enforcement of authorization policies be implemented. This again will be something that we will cover further down in the webinar. But in terms of all these common questions, what we have come to a conclusion in terms of what we could call a common conclusion, not to marginalize anybody else who doesn't get covered in this set of bullets, is that externalizing authorization offers maximum value if your organization has complex authorization needs. As I mentioned, if your authorization needs are perfectly filled by the existing frameworks and you don't see a big change in them, you don't see a big growth in any of these complex policies which are not right now complex, that would not be what you would want to look at. But if you're an organization which has complex authorization needs because of the number of applications you have, the number of users you have, or the context of the authorization you have, you would want to externalize your systems. And as before, you would want to do that also if you want to separate out implementation of application and authorization logic. And if you have a lot of in-house developed and maintained application, because it becomes easier to have the option of changing these codes as and when you need it, or at least you know how the system works internally, so it becomes easier for you to externalize your authorization systems. Or if nothing else, your infrastructure is used for integration, either in the service bus point of view, or you have XML gateways and other common gateways that helps integrate various services. All these become helpful when you try to decide what is the best point to externalize your software and what would be the best hooks that needs to be placed to do so. So now that we have kind of covered why you would want to externalize your authorization framework, let's dwell a bit more into how you would want to do that. If you take a common software stack, it spans a whole range of concerns. You can start all the way from the presentation tier, the JSPs, the JSFs, and the ASP.NET web controls. You could have authorization there, which allows a person to upload certain files, or it allows somebody to insert database content and so on. That's one level. And then you also have the web apps and the web services tier, where you say that, okay, I have the container in which my application is running, and I can enforce authorization at that point. And of course, you can go a bit lower down in the business tier, the ESBs, the JMS.NETs, the BizTalks, and the Java Pojo level, and say, I want to enforce authorization at that point. Or if you want to go more nearer to your actual data that you're trying to protect, you could say, I would rather have it at the data tier in the Oracle VPDs or a system similar to that, and say, I want to make it as nearer to where the data resides as possible. Now, the good thing about externalizing your system, the model behind it is that you're able to put your policy enforcement point anywhere in that stack and still talk to the same decision point or multiple decision points. But the common point being, of course, that the modularity allows you to put your enforcement point hooks into whichever level that allows you to do it seamlessly. If you decide that Web Apps way is the best for you as a servlet filter, there are possibilities of inserting a policy enforcement point there. Or if you say the JSP way of doing it is the best for you, you can do that, and so on and so forth. So the question of where to intercept the access request, because as I mentioned earlier, when the user tries to access a resource, you want to be able to intercept that request, gather the information regarding the request, and send it off to the policy decision point, the actual engine that decides whether to allow access or not. But for you to do that, you need to find out which is the best place. So let's assume that you are looking at the different logical places within your application stack where you might be able to do that. This is not an exhaustive list of places, but it's just to give you a flavor of what are the options available to you. Down the line is if you are not able to do something, you go from the top to the bottom. And if you are able to use a specific block, you can go to the horizontal side towards the left. And the question, of course, first you can ask is, do you maintain the application code? And is the code available to you? And do you have the resources to change that code as you want? Then you could call your authorization service from your application itself. But let's say you can't do that. Then the next question is, because your application, say your application is running inside a container, a Tomcat container, or whatever it is, can you do you have control over the app server itself on the environment that it's running in? Then if so, you can use a servlet filter, a good example of using authorization within an app server. So you can place the hooks to call the policy decision point within the servlet, and then when the servlet says something about the decision made, the access request can either be granted, or the user can be sent off to a point which is not authorized. But if you are in a situation where you don't have access to your app code, you don't have control over your application server container, the question then you can ask is, are the apps called via the gateways? So do you have gateways that you can hook onto the systems and that you have control over? Then you could enforce your policies at those gateways, making it easier for people to access, to enforce the decision there. Now, exactly how you hook onto the gateway really depends upon the gateway that you're using within your systems. You could implement it as filters within the gateway. You can implement it as plugins within the gateway, or you can just call external services. Some of the gateways allow you to do that, to call external services to do these authorization checks. So one example that we have encountered before is if you have a legacy system which cannot, you don't have the source code control for, you cannot control the application server, say the mainframe system, but it can talk to an external gateway. So the external gateway where all this access request comes in from the application before it's actually processed by the resource guardian would be the best place to then call out the authorization service. But suppose you don't use gateways within your infrastructure and your system is not geared towards that. Then the next thing you can then think of is whether you use service buses within your infrastructure. So if you have a ESB, enterprise service bus, or you have any other similar system messaging systems, you could then basically add your authorization service onto that bus as a service, which can then be controlled by the messaging queue that you have, and their services can talk to each other, asking for authorization decisions, and you can add that logic within the service bus itself. So again, this is not an exhaustive list of what's possible, but this would hopefully get you started in the right questions to ask so that you have an idea of where would be the best place to actually put your interception request. Best place to intercept the access request before it is sent off to the policy decision point. So now that I've given you an idea of what is possible, let me give you an example of what we have seen when dealing with customer requests in terms of enforcing authorization and providing hooks to the authorization systems. It's basically a use case which kind of embodies a lot of why you would want to externalize the system, and also what would be the good place to externalize those systems. Let's say you have a business process which supports a business process supporting application. So you start with step 1, you go to step 2, and at step 3, and there's a flow which goes from 1 to 2, 3. And in each of these steps, you have to, say, access data storage. It could be a document storage, for example, which was the case in our scenario. But you use that not directly, but through APIs which are exposed at the data storage level. Now, suppose this is your infrastructure, and you want to decide what would be the best place to put your authorization system. Of course, You could go to the data storage right at the bottom there and say, okay, I have a data storage system, a document retrieval system or storage system, and I could have a wrapper around it right here, or a plugin which hooks onto the data storage system and then call out the PEP and the PDP. But that would, of course, mean that you would want to have a PEP within the data storage, which might be not feasible in a lot of cases. But more importantly, because of the way the thing is structured, when you have information that is available only at the business process level and which doesn't get filtered all the way to the data storage level, if you write your PEPs to gather the information about the request and send it off to the PDP, you're missing vital information on which the policies may have been written. So the data store doesn't have the capability to externalize the SACML authorization out of the box. And also the access permission depends on state of the calling workflow and the attributes or properties that are available within the workflow. So if you look at both of these limitations in a way, you will see that the best place you would want to actually implement your policy enforcement point would be somewhere in between the process which is actually driving the application and where it hits the actual data access point. And in our case, we had a web service which was exposing APIs, which was using APIs of the data storage and run as a web service. So it was kind of a right place to put the PEPs and call to the PDP. Just to make it a bit more concrete, what we had as a data storage was the Documentum content management platform, which is the enterprise level content management platform. And the use case had an example of a user requesting access to a data or a file, but you can only allow access if that user requesting that access is member of the case in which the document belongs. So a case, for example, would be a litigation case, or it could be just a patient records on the patient case. So you do allow access only if the user also belongs to that case to which the document belongs. And that's not something that can be easily stored within the data storage systems, but it's still available easily within the business process which runs and accesses this information from the data storage systems. And of course, it becomes also costly to implement the policy enforcement point within Documentum, just as an example. But a generic commercial off-the-shelf software, there is a reason why you bought it, because it does a great job of providing you the functionalities, but there are, of course, corner cases which may not be readily available as a solution. Would you rather mess around with the internals of it, or work around on the wrapper side of things to see which is the best way of implementing your PEP? So the web service layer, which we just mentioned before in the previous slide, was a good entry point to implement the policy enforcement point. And it was a great place because there was an existing framework in terms of filters that we could leverage on. There was code access to the actual full-blown implementation of that layer, unlike the documented system, which is an off-the-shelf software. So what we did was to implement a filter, the code of which I will show in the next slide. Basically, for people who don't like to meddle in codes, I'll just give you a quick idea of what is happening here. Every filter has got a do filter method, which basically gets called when that filter is invoked. And what we are saying now here is that we hook the PEP into this do filter method, and that calls the external PDPs. So the try catch block here is the one which is actually calling the external PDPs. What we're saying here is that I am going to ask the PDP for a decision about whether this access is permitted or not. And what I will give to the PDP is the username of that person, which you can capture from the session information, and also the document ID, which is, again, hopefully a session information you can tap. Or you could also query the the API is exposed by document or any other data storage to get that information. You send this whole thing off to the PDP, and the PDP decides based on its role whether to allow access or not. And when you get back a response, what the code then does is check whether it's a 0. 0 in using our PEP SDK that Axiomatics provides means that the decision is allowed. The decision is a permit, which means the access can be granted. Then if it is not 0, there are 3 other cases where it's not 0, it basically means that he is not permitted to access, and then you could easily redirect that query to a page which is not authorized or HTML, which basically says that because of reasons that you can specify further down, that user is not allowed access to that information that he is requesting. So that would be an example of an access request that we would want to implement within a filter, and that we showed as a part of the system. Now, to give you an idea of what the system will look like if you are using the PEP SDK that Axiomatics provides, let me just pull up some of the things that I can show out here. Let's give you a quick idea of what it looks like if you're starting using the SDK that Axiomatics provides. What I am having in front of me is a slightly modified version of the developer edition of Axiomatics Policy Server, which gets you the PEP SDK, the PDP that you can play with, and a demo application. Now, I don't want to write the full-blown application and how it hooks onto the document as service and so on. But what I want to show is a simple idea of how PEPs can be written. So I have a PDP which is deployed with the policy which says that if the username is myself, Srijit, and I'm trying to access document ID as doc123, allow access to that thing, and no other combination of access should be provided allowed. In my case, I have 2 usernames, Srijit and Finn, and document123 and document789. So let's just take the positive case first to make sure it actually works, hopefully. So I have Srijit and document123. I click and I get a permit from the PDP. I'll go into the logic of exactly how it's done. And just to give you an idea of making sure that it doesn't work if you're not Srijit, you get back a deny on any other options combination. So Srijit and 789 also does not work. So that is a quick idea of the front end of the application, what you would see as a user. But the back end, let's just get an idea of how this is done. As before, you can do it using this filter PEP. So you have a do filter method, and can you implement it here? But that's not all, because you are provided with the full SDK of all the things that you have on the right hand side. For those who haven't worked with Eclipse, this is the Eclipse in the IDE that I mostly use for my Java work. So you get all these client jar files that you can work with from the SDK point of view that allows you to start working and writing your PEPs. So what I have done in this simple application is I have a JSP demo, which basically calls, if you look at the index.call, it basically calls the JSP PEP, which is somewhere here. And then at the JSP PEP level, I have an application code which basically uses the information that we provide. So you basically uses the libraries that we provide to create a SACML request. So I basically get information about the form data which was submitted, and I populate it and get my username, and I get my document ID. I build that as a SACML request and send it off to the PDP, which I have connected using my pdp.properties file. In this case, is a PDP which is running on a local machine because it's a self-contained development environment. And then you can shoot this information to the PDP and get back a response from the PDP and say what exactly happened. And thus, if I want to change logic here, which is independent of the application, I can run it at the PDP level. And if I want to change the information which is captured, you can write it at the PEP level based on the information that you have within the JSP PEP. Just to complete the picture, you of course also have sample standalone PEPs which can use exactly the same SDKs, where I am, in this case, I'm just writing standalone application. So I'm writing a new SACML request connecting to the PDP, which is part of the pdp.properties file out here, which is a local file. And I'm generating a new request asking the PDP whether a username Srijit and can access document doc123. And let's just see if it runs. So simple run as Java application. And you will get back, you will see that the output for me, I just printed out the actual SACML request, which was sent, Srijit asking for doc123, and the response is a permit. And if I change this now to Fin, just to show that it actually works, run as, again, a Java application, you get back not applicable, which is basically saying that this policy is not applicable to anybody other than Srijit. That's just the way the policy is written. You might get back a deny in your specific case, where, for example, if I change this to Srijit and I change this to 1, 2, 3, 4, and I run the application again, you will get back a deny because I'm still Srijit, but I'm trying to access a document which is not allowed. And so you get back a document 1 to 3. So this is a quick idea, a demonstration of what the development environment looks like once you start implementing your PEPs using the SDK we provide. You can specify the properties of the PDP, how to connect, what are the username and the password. Then you can use the SACML request builder to build your request, capturing all the information that you have within that context, be it at the lower level or the higher level as the JSP or the filter PEP or the standalone PEP application, Java application that you saw a demo of. So with that in mind, let me just go to the last part of the slide to give you an to conclude this presentation. So as you saw, we can do a catch the request within the filter of a servlet or standalone application or as the JSP PEP that we show as a demo. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. We have set aside a bit of time for people to ask questions if you have any, and feel free to write it within the window of the GoToMeeting, and we'll be happy to answer the questions that you have.
Great. Thank you, Srijit. So this is Finn again. We did receive some questions during the session. The first question, though, for you, Srijit, is from me. Why were you allowed to access the document then? And I was not. That's a bit unfair, I think.
That's kind of narcissistic of me, I guess.
Yeah. No, but let's start off. We did get some highly technical question to the SDK as such. So in your code example, you had a 0 representing the permit. So
yep.
Why not use response permit? Why response not 0?
Oh, right. So because Java, it's basically the way we try to implement the in the Java as a language. Because if you represent permit as a string, it's a bit hard in Java to compare strings. So we thought, okay, the easiest way to do that is using numericals. Let's just put it there. But of course, you have response.permit as a constant that you can compare against. That's also possible. I just wrote it as equal to 0. Just to give you an idea that 0 is the permit equivalent. So response.permit is a valid thing because response.permit is a constant that we have within the PDP, PEP environment.
Right. So you could to improve readability of your code, you could use a constant name as well, right?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, of course. And we do have that constant in the product.
Yep.
So you could use the constant. Permit. Okay. Good. Another thing to that topic: why did you in this example print the? Now I'm not quite sure. So the question reads: why is system out print line and not throwing a specific SDK exception? That may have been to the other.
So yes, of course we.
Well,
So I guess it's most probably about the sample application that I showed in the now what I have no idea what happened to the actual application. But yeah, the sample application that you see here may be a bit distorted view of what you're seeing, but just give me a second. I think something comped up. Why? No, don't leave the webinar. But it could be because of the system outs that we see here, and the other, and you have a generic exceptions that we are thrown here. Now, it's just to make the code easier to fit within the window that I want to show. Of course, we have specific SDK exceptions. We have a connection exceptions. We have a SACML response exceptions and so on. And actually, if you have Eclipse as an environment and you have imported the Java doctor and all that properly, you would also be prompted to actually show to kind of try catch the exceptions which is most relevant to your case. And if you look at the actual, you can actually see that some of these throw exceptions, and they can be imported within the application library.
Okay. Great, Sri. I hope that answers the question from the audience. Now let's yeah, well, we have one follow up on the technical side as well. If we do have real PEP examples with exceptions and without the print line code, and I think the answer to that is yes, indeed, we do. But I guess, Sri, that will go a bit beyond the scope and time frames of this webinar, right?
Yeah, but
So,
we can, if somebody is interested and if they want to drop us an email, we'll be more than happy to. If you already have the PEP SDK, we'll be more than happy to give you an example of what are the exceptions that can be thrown and caught within your environment.
Yeah. I expect so the objectives with this webinar is really to show high-level samples. So these are very much made with clarity in mind to make it obvious how it works. In reality, I would expect that we do have a bit more. So basically, the SDK requires 4 calls. Now, we create the PDP connection, build the request, evaluate, and then act on the response, right? And that is what you want to show, I guess, basically here. But in reality, I suppose that live examples may be a bit more complex than what we see here, of course.
It will definitely be. It will.
Yeah. I've heard of customers who use, very large amounts of attributes, and then of course the request builder as such will be a piece of code.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So then we have some less technical questions as well. So the first one, you talked about the various drivers and mentioned compliance as being one. So what are the major compliance requirements driving externalized authorization?
Well, of course there are no concerns which talks about externalizing authorization. It's just that a lot of the compliance regulations which are in place deal with complex policies which have a life cycle of its own and a management system of its own. And then it becomes quite evident that the more complex your policies become, it's easier to manage it centrally. It's easier to manage it away from your application code. And that's where the actual externalizing aspects of the authorization system comes into place. It's not that a specific regulation calls for externalizing authorization. It's kind of implied or a derived conclusion from the fact that the policies needed to be implemented are so complex.
Right. Yeah, and I think we did a survey some time ago on where we tried to establish why actually we saw our customers investing in moving towards externalized authorization, and in almost 1/3 of the cases, compliance issues are sort of there, and I think we see there's a great variety there in the financial services. Of course, we have all the regulations that mandate governance in the financial services. We have privacy requirements in the public sector and in healthcare. We have export control in some parts of industry and the like. So there are very different reasons, very different types of regimes that you may need to comply with. But good. We have more questions. So what are your experiences with binding the PDP to the application in terms of attribute fetch? This example shows that session attributes are added to the initial request, but is it always the case that all attributes can be added up front? So Sridhar, your screen is
can you see anything?
Disappearing now. We see a lot. We see the entire.
Oh, okay.
Can you?
Is that better?
So yeah. So basically, I think this is very much about the division of roles between the policy information points from an XACML perspective on the PDP side, and what attributes do we throw into the request? Mm-hmm. What attributes will we have to go and retrieve server side?
Right. So it's actually a very commonly asked question, and of course there is no obvious answer, but there are guidelines that and best practices in a way. As you said, rightly pointed out, whoever asked the question, there are attributes which may not always be available, accessible to the JSP case in this case, or there are attributes which are actually so dynamic that it can change values within the time that you capture it in the PEP and send it off to the PDP. So the questions to ask are the following. If you have information which is readily available to you at the PEP side, the obvious conclusion is that would be the right place to put it into the XACML request and send it off to the PDP. But sometimes, for example, you have the username of a person, but you don't have the role associated with that person. And role is what the policy checks for. It would be more natural then to just put the username as a part of the XACML request attribute and then expect the PDP to find the equivalent role of that person. So those are in the terminology of XACML, it's basically the duty of the PDP using the policy information point. So it could be using an LDAP directory to query this information out. So that is one obvious kind of split between which component captures information for attributes. The other example is, I mentioned, is the dynamic nature of these values. If you have information that changes dynamically enough, you would then want to fetch it as late into the flow as possible just before the policy is evaluated. So if the state of a resource changes every couple of seconds, a minute, or whatever it is, you might say that, okay, I will not just take it at the PEP side. I will wait for the PDP to fetch it while it's actually processing the policy. Mm-hmm. So that's another way of figuring out which would be the best place to capture your attributes. Do you have any more, Finn? Any other?
Yeah, David. This leads over to another related question. Then, doesn't externalizing authorization raise performance issues? In what way can these be handled? From the example, such as simple policy, it seems that the request seems fairly verbose. So, and that of course also has to do with the policy information points going and retrieving.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yes, I mean, because you externalize, you have another system in place which needs to be contacted. So there will definitely be an overhead in terms of response time, because we have to go up and down the network to get the information. If your application is very sensitive in terms of network delays and round trip times, the other option you can provide is kind of between the two worlds kind of scenario, where You still externalize your logic from the application, in the sense you don't do if else and if then else kind of clauses in your application or your SQL statement, but you still call a PDP. It's just that the PDP then gets embedded within your application. This is not completely externalizing your PD decision point, because it still resides within the same infrastructure, same host, and sometimes within the same container. But at least it makes the bit more decoupled from your applications, which means if you have a policy which is managed centrally, you can then push it onto this embedded PDP, which can decide on these things quickly and more easily compared to an external PDP, which has the overhead of the network latency.
Mm-hmm. Right. And yes, and I think it also may be worthwhile to mention, we do have customers with extreme performance requirements, and where they manage to get it to work. So it's of course it is a challenge for sure, but it's not an unmanageable challenge. And one thing that we also see, I think, that may be worth mentioning, is the fact that people use directories, virtual directories, or other ways to retrieve the attributes to make them readily available, right?
Yeah, and if you are concerned about the attribute fetching part of the PDP, we also provide attribute caching, which can be done at the PDP. So if you often use certain attributes, when you look up, when you decide on policies, there are ways in which you can cache these values, which can then be used. Of course, the value of the cache depends on the questions you ask next, but these are options that are available to the user who wants to implement attribute-based access control in PDPs.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Sri, we have more questions than we actually have time to answer, I think. Let me do one more, and then I think we almost need to close the session. So in your example, you protect one entry point. I guess this is to the the document store that you showed, via an API to this content management system. But that leaves many other entry points open. Shouldn't security be implemented at a lower level, ideally? It's a good question, I think.
Yeah, it's actually a good question, and it drives to the core point of trying to protect information as nearer to where the information resides. And you're right, because we do recommend that authorization is implemented as far down in the stack as possible. Possible, of course, it's not just the fact that possible from a vendor point of view, but also possible from the attributes that are required and so on. We will talk about, so if you remember the slides that was presented in terms of the tiers, there is of course the data tier, and you can put the PEP at the data tier. And that's kind of talking about the Axiomatics data filtering capabilities. It's actually the subject of the webinar which we have later this fall, where we actually change the SQL statement which is generated based on the policy. And so when you actually hit the database, you filter the SQL statement, change it based on the policies, and then query the database. So it's much, much lower down than the application layer. At the same time, you got to be a bit practical and pragmatic about how much you want to do and where you want to do it. The security solution that's implemented is always better than the one that makes a nice design on the architecture drawing board, but it might be complicated and cumbersome to implement. So depending upon your risk appetite and what you consider as overhead, what you consider as that you can live with, if you can solve 80% of the problem by catching something higher up but easier to implement, you might say, okay, that is good enough for me, and I will leave the further 20% further down to figure out further down the line. So that's kind of a generic answer to the question, which is actually still a very good question.
Very good, Sri. It sounds like a diplomatic answer that we probably could continue to discuss further, but our time is up, and I think we need to thank the audience we've had a great interest for this webinar, and we're very grateful, of course, that you have spent this time with us. Again, let me remind you about the upcoming webinars on other interesting topics, and stay tuned. There will be more from us. Thank you very much for today. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.